All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore exactly how the defeat of the Axis powers in 1945 almost immediately gave birth to a terrifying, brand new global conflict.
I mean, it's honestly one of the most incredible pivots in modern history. How on earth did a post-war alliance turn into a global nuclear standoff in literally just 5 years? To figure that out, we really need to trace the rapid, domino-like escalation of geopolitical tension that kicked off right after World War II ended.
So here's our roadmap. Number 1, the post-war power vacuum. 2, the containment strategy. 3, dividing Europe. 4, militarizing the Cold War. And 5, containment goes global.
Okay, Section 1, the post-war power vacuum, Yalta and Potsdam.
Picture this. Britain and France are exhausted, right? Totally weakened by years of war. So a massive power vacuum opens up on the world stage. Naturally, the United States and the Soviet Union step right into it, but they are bringing starkly different visions to the table. President Franklin Roosevelt firmly believed long-term stability relied on Wilsonian principles, things like democratic self-determination, collective security, and free trade. But for Joseph Stalin, his absolute #1 priority was national security. He was insisting on extracting heavy reparations from Germany and, crucially, setting up a defensive perimeter of pro-Soviet buffer states across Eastern Europe.
Now, behind closed doors, the friction was already there. But it didn't take long for that private tension to spill out into public hostility. By February 1946, Stalin delivers this speech where he basically says the unevenness of development of the capitalist countries is likely to produce violent disturbance. Leaning heavily on Marxist-Leninist principles, Stalin was essentially blaming the capitalist West for any and all future wars.
While the West's reaction? Immediate and escalating. Just a month later, Winston Churchill fires back with his famous response, declaring that an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. He was openly accusing the Soviets of using what he called police government to control and divide the people of Eastern Europe.
And over in Washington, attitudes just completely hardened. President Harry S. Truman matches this escalating rhetoric step for step, stating unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. It's a classic spiral. Neither side truly understood or trusted the other, and both were just projecting their absolute worst fears onto their former allies.
Moving on to Section 2, the containment strategy and economic weapons.
So between 1946 and 1949, this deep fear of Soviet expansion pushes the U.S. to formalize a brand new policy. The absolute anchor term you need to know for this era is containment. It was proposed by an American diplomat named George F. Kennan in his famous Long Telegram. Containment argued that the U.S. had to meet the Soviets with, quote, unalterable counterforce at every single turn. The goal? Limit their influence strictly to Eastern Europe. Almost overnight, containment becomes the absolute linchpin of American foreign policy.
Now, what's crucial here is that this early phase of containment, it wasn't military at all. It was entirely economic. The Truman Doctrine in 1947 rolled out $400 million in aid to prop up Greece and Turkey against armed insurgencies. And then, the very next year, we see the launch of the Marshall Plan. This pumped a staggering $13 billion of U.S. capital into rebuilding Europe's completely devastated economy. The logic was actually pretty simple. If you rebuild the economy, starving, dispirited citizens won't turn to communist parties out of sheer desperation.
Section 3, dividing Europe and the Berlin Flashpoint.
Let's look at how fast this actually escalates in Germany, which was the ultimate strategic prize in Europe. When the Western Allies consolidated their German zones in 1947 to jumpstart the economy, Stalin didn't just sit back. He reacted in June 1948 by completely blockading all traffic to West Berlin. But instead of folding, the US and the UK pull off the unbelievable Berlin airlift. They flew in 2.5 million tons of supplies. We're talking about landing a plane almost every single minute for nearly a year. Stalin finally lifts the blockade in May 1949, but the damage was done. The East-West relationship was permanently fractured. And this crisis directly triggered the institutionalization of the Cold War, locking everything in with the formation of the NATO military alliance in April 1949.
Section 4, militarizing the Cold War and the nuclear pivot. Okay, so just as things in Berlin sort of settle down, boom! A massive technological shock permanently alters the global balance of power. In September 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonates an atomic bomb. America's brief run as the world's only nuclear power? Over. This was an incredibly brave event. It completely wiped out the U.S.'s sole strategic advantage and forced President Truman to demand a total, top-to-bottom reassessment of American strategy.
That strategic panic led straight to a document called NSC 68. You really have to understand this one. NSC 68 was a 1950 National Security Council report, and it was just bristling with alarmist rhetoric. It called for a massive U.S. military buildup, higher taxes on Americans to pay for it all, and the rapid development of an even more destructive hydrogen bomb to counter Soviet ambitions. This is it. This is the exact moment the Cold War militarized. Containment aggressively shifted away from just sending economic aid and pivoted right into heavy, permanent military readiness.
And the financial fallout of this policy? Absolutely staggering. Because of this militarization, by 1953, defense spending had absolutely skyrocketed to $50 billion. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 66%, nearly two-thirds of the entire federal budget. Even during peacetime, the United States had transformed into a nation in a state of permanent military mobilization.
Which brings us to Section 5, Containment Goes Global, shifting to the Asian theater.
By 1949, Mao Zedong's communist victory in China really sets off panic bells in the U.S., proving that containment couldn't just be limited to Europe anymore. The whole thing boils over on June 25, 1950. Fully backed by Stalin, communist North Korean forces launch a massive surprise attack right across the 38th parallel into South Korea. The Cold War wasn't just a political standoff anymore. It had officially become a hot shooting war. The momentum of the Korean War is honestly like a massive, tragic pendulum. Let's walk through how this localized conflict spiraled into a global crisis. Step 1. North Korea pushes incredibly deep into the south, coming dangerously close to taking the whole peninsula. Step 2. General Douglas MacArthur pulls off this brilliant, totally surprise US and UN amphibious attack at Incheon, totally flipping the momentum. Step 3. American forces push all the way north, right up to the Chinese border at the Yalu River. But then, a colossal miscalculation happens. Step 4. A massive Chinese counterattack forces a chaotic, headlong US retreat back down the peninsula. And finally, Step 5. After years of just bitter, grinding stalemate, a July 1953 armistice finally locks the border right back where the whole thing started, at the 38th parallel.
I want to pause here for a second and just focus on a really somber number. 36,000. That is the number of American troops killed in the Korean War. And when you combine that with the over 900,000 South and North Korean casualties, it paints a stark, brutal picture of the devastating human cost of this first major proxy war.
To really wrap our heads around all of this, we have to understand the psychological anchor driving U.S. policy during this entire era, the Munich analogy. This was the deeply held belief, going all the way back to the disastrous appeasement of Hitler in 1938, that yielding to dictators anywhere always leads to a wider war. That historical ghost convinced American presidents that any compromise with the Soviets would inevitably lead to disaster. It drove them to staunchly, aggressively resist perceived Soviet influence on every corner of the globe.
Which leads us to a pretty massive, provocative question. Driven by these ghosts of appeasement, the U.S. embraced a state of permanent global military readiness. But at what cost to its own stated democratic principles? The pure terror of another world war permanently locked the U.S. into a wildly expensive and, let's be honest, sometimes morally compromising global military posture. It literally changed the nation forever. So what's the big takeaway here? We have to keep questioning our history because it's actively shaping the world we live in today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.